President Salovey, Professors Chakrabarty, Majumdar, and Smale, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of this year's Tanner Lectures. Thank you all for coming. I want to give you an overview of events to begin with. Immediately after today's lecture, you're all invited to a reception, which will be straight out the doors to the back of the auditorium and down the hall in room 108. The second lecture then will take place tomorrow afternoon, again at 5 o'clock right here. After it, there will be time, after the second lecture, there will be time for questions from the audience. On Friday morning at 10:30, finally, we will regather with Professor Chakrabarty here again for further discussion of his lectures, a discussion that will include Daniel Lord Smale from Harvard University and Yale's own Wai-Chi Dimmock and Michael Warner. The Tanner Lectures on Human Values were established by the American scholar and industrialist Obert Clark Tanner. Born in 1904, Tanner studied at the University of Utah, and after receiving a law degree there, he pursued philosophy at both Harvard University and Stanford University. At Stanford, he became acting chaplain and was later appointed to the faculty in religion. In 1946, he joined the faculty of philosophy at the University of Utah, from which he retired in 1974. He published several books on the New Testament. Obert Tanner died in 1993. Meanwhile, back in 1927, in his mother's basement, Tanner had begun an industrial enterprise that grew to be the largest firm of its kind in the United States. The O.C. Tanner Company, jewelers specializing in corporate recognition awards, provided the material base for the extensive philanthropies of Tanner and his wife, Grace. In creating the lectureships, Tanner hoped that they would contribute to the intellectual and moral life of humankind. He saw the purpose of the lectures as the advancement of and reflection on scholarly and scientific learning relating to human values. Appointment as a Tanner lecturer, he expected, would be a recognition of uncommon achievement and outstanding abilities in this broadly bounded arena. Given these hopes and expectations, there could scarcely be a more worthy Tanner lecturer than Dipesh Chakrabarty from the University of Chicago. Professor Chakrabarty is the Lawrence A. Kimpton Distinguished Service Professor of History and South Asian Languages and Civilizations. He holds subsidiary appointments, are you ready for this, also in English, comparative literature, the Center for Contemporary Theory, Cinema and Media Studies, and the Law School. The mind boggles at the very amount of committee work that he must have to do in all these places. Have I left out any, by the way? No. Before moving to Chicago, Professor Chakrabarty taught at the University of Melbourne and the Australian National University, from which he took his PhD in 1984. To say that Professor Chakrabarty is a historian is to speak the truth. His latest book, forthcoming this year, concerns the Bengali historian Jadunath Sarkar and is entitled The Calling of History. And Professor Chakrabarty has often shared in his writings glowing intuitions into the thinking and doing of history. Last year, in fact, he was awarded the Toynbee Prize for his contributions to global history. But his influence has opened out to far wider horizons than those of most historians. He is a foremost theorist of post-coloniality, global modernity, and transnational capitalism. In these endeavors, he took his start early, as he was a founding member in the 1980s of the Subaltern Studies Committee, or Subaltern Studies Collective, I'm sorry. The mix of critical theory and historical craft has served him brilliantly well. His widely read and hugely influential book, Provincializing Europe, is theorized history and historicized theory of the most bracing sort. Professor Chakrabarty's post-colonial project is a distinctive and nuanced one. Provincializing Europe was, as its title suggests, in part an exercise in describing the local habitations of European structures of thought and colonial practices. But its theoretical stance was not an assertion of unfettered cultural difference, of the sort sometimes encountered in the 1990s. His intent, as he noted some years later, was not to militate against all universalist thinking in the humanities, not to provincialize all things and thus pluralize human reason itself as no more than the shifting product of local constraints and contingencies. Instead, he aimed at understanding human universals as necessary but unstable placeholders in negotiating the translations involved in gesturing out from local habitations. To understand, and I quote him, how thought is related to place was his effort, how universalist notions are always pinned down to local histories and lifeways. The importance of such local habitations in his thinking, they are signaled again in the title of his collection of essays, Habitations of Modernity, has never receded. This has determined for him a nuanced position, distant from scholars of sheer difference, as I've said, but also firmly resistant to those whose confidence in stable, usually Eurocentric, truths remains unshaken even today. Along another axis, it has placed him at odds with certain other conceptions of modernity advanced by post-colonial theorists of a different stripe than he. He has opposed, gently, always in his polemics, those who aim to dissolve the impact of local lifeways into a uniform transnational non-place inhabited by all of us in the era of globalized capital. This path, in his view, cannot avoid effacing crucial distinctions introduced by locality itself, and cannot avoid, as it effaces them, reasserting the very relations of power it had hoped to escape. Once again, Professor Chakrabarty insists, the relation of thought to place needs to come to the fore. In emphasizing it, he carefully maps a path between the global vectors of capitalism in the modern age and their local contingencies. Since about 2008, Professor Chakrabarty's thought has taken a new dramatic turn, one evinced in several important essays, one that we will hear about today and tomorrow. This is the turn toward thinking the Anthropocene, thinking, that is, the period when human interactions with the environment grew from the play of affordance and exploitation common to all living species into something new and different. The period when, for the first time on Earth, a single species interaction with the environment bore effects as large and pervasive as geological shifts themselves. In an essay of 2009 that became overnight standard reading in this arena, Professor Chakrabarty enunciated some general implications of humanistic thinking about climate change. He saw approaching the collapse of distinctions constructed by the end of the 19th century between human and natural histories. He began to describe the interlocking of two distinct chronologies, the interlocking of these chronologies, those of the human institutions of capitalism, industrialism, and globalization, and those of geology and evolution, and those of geological and evolutionary timescales. He began, in his own words, to conjoin our deep and our recorded histories. And, at the same time, he began to describe a new mode of post-humanistic thought as it appeared through the post-colonial lens, a species thinking very different from that described in the long German century of Hegelian and Marxist thought. This new direction does not come without huge challenges for our thought and, one hopes, our actions. Here, in no doubt simplified form, is one basic challenge, a question Professor Chakrabarty raises before us and will explore today. If our thought must needs be localized, shaped by the contingencies of habitations and lifeways, how do we adjust it to move forward against a global catastrophe that looms ever more clearly? How, in short, does thought marshal itself to action when its local habitation is planet Earth? Please join me in welcoming Professor Dipesh Chakrabarty.
You know, as you get older, there's not just older, at certain historic moments, there are funny kind of trade-offs you make with technology. So when, and this will interest Gary, when the technology of recording music came to India, many of the old musicians who actually transited to recorded music found this problem, that they were used to, even when singing, yelling, whereas the microphone required them to modulate their voice and to express emotions. And they said, you either have emotions or you have my voice. So you either have, I either have my eyes or I don't. Thank you very much. Thank you, President Salovi, and your Tanner Committee, Gary Tomlinson, for inviting me to give these lectures. I realize what a great honor and privilege it is to have been so invited. Since we're having questions at the end of, no, this is the trade-off. I can't see your faces now. I can see my own words better, but you can hear them better. There'll be questions at the end of the second lecture. Fortunately, it so happens that the first lecture is a little longer, so I'll probably fill up a better part of what could have been question time. but we'll try not to fill up all of it. So as you heard, from some time now, I've been thinking about the question of climate change, not obviously as a scientist or a policy person or even as an activist. I've been very interested in thinking how themes to do with globalization, which is what I'd been studying before, even though from a post-colonial angle, interact with the science of global warming. And this becomes particularly visible in the discussion to do with climate justice. And that's what I'll come to it. Mainly, as the IPCC scientists, climate scientists began to say that this particular episode of climate change was anthropogenic or human-induced, questions arose naturally as to who would pay for the damages it caused. And on the polluter pays principle, it was decided, first at the Rio conference of 1992, and then at the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, that the principle for paying for the damages that climate change causes would be the assumption that nations and people bore common but differentiated responsibility. Now, the expression differentiated responsibility, and this is a lot of climate politics turns around this, particularly between nations. Even when they gather in Paris the next time, this will be a critical question. The idea of differentiated responsibilities is quite easy to understand. The meaning is that it's the Western developed nations, including Japan, who had done most of the emitting of greenhouse gases, of the offending gases, and therefore they should pay. And so, in a way, the expression common but differentiated responsibilities, it's clear that it's these two words coming together, differentiated responsibilities, that bring the story that the scientists tell, which is actually about a relationship between climate and what they call earth processes, into a relationship with the familiar stories of globalization. That is, into a relationship with the uneven and iniquitous history of world capitalism, the emergence of a global media and a global market, and so on. So it situates, the idea of differentiated responsibility actually situates climate change as a climactic point in the history of globalization. But the question I'm going to ask in these lectures, in the two lectures, is how do we understand the word common? In what sense is responsibility common as well? Was common simply an empty rhetorical bargaining device used to placate the richer countries' insistence on the responsibility of emerging powers like China and India? Was it a word that was meant simply to defer the responsibility of the emerging powers, the idea that they would become responsible too, but only after they had industrialized enough and had emitted enough greenhouse gases to qualify? But then there was also this recognition, and this has only grown with every report of the IPCC, that the problem of global warming produces its own timeline for urgent global action, irrespective of the question of responsibility, mainly because the atmosphere doesn't think about who is more responsible. That is, if we were to avert the truly dangerous effects of climate change, which unfortunately and unfairly would affect the poor more than the rich. So scholars are agreed that planetary climate change cannot be addressed as a problem, as distinct from the many actions we can take regionally or locally. So the planetary aspect of climate change cannot be addressed unless there's a global political will that will help humans deal with their shared planetary crisis. And a lot of scholars have actually made this point that what is needed is that we have all our economic transformations happen quickly enough so that the world can come together, so that the Indian, the Chinese governments are happy that they've had enough economic development so that we can come together in time with a global political will to address this problem. Now, for a host of reasons, the global response has been much slower than needed. And global warming does not even merit the same level of public discussion in nations such as India, where corruption and environmental pollution are supreme concerns. So in an interesting way, even though these are two big themes of our time, global warming and globalization, global warming itself is somehow not as global as an issue as globalization is. Now, I do not intend to explain why global response to climate change has not been as forthcoming as many think it should have been. There are many interesting explanations. We can go into those explanations when we discuss them, from wicked problem thesis to human perceptual problems with anything that develops exponentially. As I said, my aim is much more modest. So basically, I want to share some thoughts with you on the word common, in the expression common but differentiated responsibilities. I submit to you that the word common is much less obvious than the expression differentiated responsibility. Its meaning is not given. Both the word common and what it may stand for when we say common responsibility may actually have to be composed in the Latourian sense of the word. So even if it was thrown in as an empty word during the bargaining, it actually takes a certain significance from being empty, and therefore opens up an area for both intellectual and then political work for actually the composition of what might be referred to by the word common. And therefore, my basic, one of the fundamental propositions I start from is that the story of globalization and the idea of differentiated responsibility are important, necessary, but insufficient part of what needs to be explained. Now, it's true that this common cannot be composed, that is, our planetary collectivity cannot be composed ever by ignoring the intensely politicized and necessarily fragmented domain of the global that understandably converts scientist statements about humans as the cause of climate change into a charged discussion about moral responsibility and capability. But we cannot think the common by immersing ourselves in the politics of climate justice either, because such politics will always reduce climate change to a problem of globalization and its discontents. That is, to the familiar themes of power and injustice. What a climate scholar, Clive Hamilton, said recently in response to an essay by Ulrich Beck is pertinent here. And Hamilton said, "One cannot come to grips with climate change if it is cast only as a problem of power relations and differences between humans." And that's my starting point. So my starting point in these lectures is the observation that for all their overlaps, the stories of globalization and the stories that climate scientists tell with regard to global warming have this one difference separating them. Humans are central to all stories of globalization, celebratory or critical. The science, so that is, one could say that stories of globalization are necessarily homocentric in the way they're told. The science of global warming, on the other hand, invites us to see humans on an expanded canvas of history, spanning the geological history of the planet and the story of life on it. By life, I mean natural reproductive life, not bios, to follow Agamben and Arendt's reworking of Aristotle, and to bracket for the moment the disagreement that Aristotle scholars have expressed with Agamben's Arendt-inspired reading of the Zoe-bios opposition. Life, not humans, emerges as one of the main concerns of the literature on climate science. I will describe these points of view, respectively, as homocentric and zoe-centric views of the world. I'll spend the time at my disposal today in setting up a framework for situating and handling this distinction. Tomorrow, I will elaborate further on the implications of this distinction for thinking the word common in relationship to the expression differentiated responsibility. So from where and how does a humanist historian begin to think in order to contribute to the work of composing the common without in the process denying all that divides us in the space of politics? While others may propose different starting points, let me begin by retrieving an idea that was mooted in the period when the fear of a nuclear winter was a widely shared feeling, where people were thinking kind of out of a horizon of catastrophe. And the particular idea I have in mind is signaled in the title of tonight's talk, is the German philosopher Karl Jaspers' conception of what he called an epochal consciousness. Jaspers is not an arbitrary choice. Since I was trying to think overall about the human condition in the Anthropocene, the Germans stand out for making the entirety of humanity for a long time the object of historical thinking. So it's not accidental that I go to a German scholar. But two aspects of his category, epochal consciousness, have some relevance to what I'm trying to do here. Jaspers' Jaspers' thinking on epochal consciousness comes out of a particular tradition, mainly German, as I said, of taking all of humanity as the object of philosophy of history. And B, relevant also is the point that Jaspers invented this category to find a form of thinking that did not foreclose the space of the political. So it was Cold War for his time, space of the political, and yet created a space of thinking, what is regarded as a perspectival and ethical space, that he imagined as pre-political. Now, pre-political not in the old Hobsbawm sense, in a particular sense. So pre-political in the sense that he thought epochal consciousness was a form of consciousness that does not deny, decry, or denounce the divisions of political life, while seeking to position itself as something that comes before politics, as it were. So a pre-position, as it were, in a pre-position with regard to the political. In other words, the question behind this thought experiment was this: is it possible to develop a shared perspectival position that can inform but not determine competitive and conflicted actions by humans when faced with the unequal and uneven perils of dangerous climate change? When we know that climate change will affect the poor more than the rich, while we also know that the rich have had more to do with the emission of greenhouse gases than the poor. So given this unfairness of the outcome of climate change, can we create a position which doesn't deny the politics that could come out of this unfairness, out of a sense of justice, but at the same time that is not completely immersed in the political? So I think this was a form of thought that Jaspers was working on for quite a while, even before the Second World War. And in the book Man in the Modern Age, that was published in German in 1931 and in English in 1933, Jaspers spelled out the idea of epochal consciousness as a problem that haunted European intellectuals for more than a century. Furthermore, he argued that it was a problem that had become urgent since the Great War, from which time the gravity of the peril to humanity had become manifest to everyone. So in a way, I'm trying to go back to this European tradition. I'll try to identify things in it, its features that we can't accept anymore today, but still try to retrieve from it a way of thinking that I think is helpful in the present context. So he explained epochal consciousness as follows. He said, man not only exists, but knows that he exists. In full awareness, he studies his world and changes it to suit his purposes. He has learned how to interfere with natural causation. Epochal consciousness for Jaspers was then a particularly modern phenomenon, a phenomenon that was possible only after man had learned to interfere with natural causation. But one has to keep in mind that as a form of consciousness, it's an ideational entity, a product of thought, or as Jaspers put it, man is mind, and the situation of man as man is a mental situation. So let us follow Jaspers a little further. While there had been transcendental and universal conceptions of history before, Christian, Judaic, Islamic, passed on from one generation to another, the continuity of this chain, argued Jaspers, was severed in the 16th century with the deliberate secularization of human life. This was the beginning of the process of European domination of the globe. It was an age of discovery, he says. The world became known in all its seas and lands. The new astronomy was born. Modern science began. The great era of technique was dawning. The state administration was being nationalized. So the French Revolution, for him, was the first event that found expression in the forms of epochal consciousness, in the work of philosophers. And he discusses that, but he actually goes on to mention Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Goethe, Tocqueville, Stendhal, Niebuhr, Talleyrand, Marx, and others, and among others Nietzsche, as bearers of different forms of epochal consciousness, ending his series with Walter Rathenau's Zur Kritik der Zeit, 1912, and Spengler's Decline of the West, 1918, as two books displaying forms of epochal consciousness that preceded his own book, Man in the Modern Age, of 1930s. And we can, of course, add to this list other names of the 20th century, including those of Martin Heidegger and Hannah Arendt. And epochal consciousness in each case was thus tied to this question of humans' perceived capacity to project themselves into the world as a collective, sovereign entity. So epochal consciousness was both a form of thought and a genre of writing, for the form could find its fully formed expression only in writings that sought to grapple with this consciousness. And therefore, Jaspers' own book, The Atom Bomb and the Future of Man becomes as a question very visible from the 1930s. Andre Malraux actually wrote a novel called Man's Fate in the early 1930s. So this question, what is the future that humanity faces, which was a kind of late 18th century question, comes back in a big way in the 20th century. And in the book on the atom bomb, and particularly after the bomb in the 50s, in this book, Jaspers sought to capture an age through a critical discussion of some of the historical statements, certain historical statements that summed up for him the dominant motives of the time. His opening sentences are something we can actually mimic in relationship to our times. So this is what he said about the bomb, and if you replace the bomb by the global warming, you can see what he was trying to grasp. An altogether novel situation has been created by the atom bomb. Either all mankind will physically perish, or there will be a change in the moral political condition of man. This book is an attempt to clarify. Having set up this to opposition, he said, this book is an attempt to clarify what strikes us as a choice between two fantasies, that either man will perish or the moral political condition will change. What will happen is obviously something in between. But he makes it clear that he needed these fantasies to work towards a new moral political condition of man. And I will register some differences with Jaspers in the course of both of these lectures, but let us travel with him a little further again before going our separate way. Jaspers explains why while dealing with epochal consciousness, called for a new mode of thinking that stood at a distance from academically specialized disciplinary formulations. And he called these specialized thinking called departmental thinking. And basically makes the point that departmental thinking is not very, and he includes politics as specialized thinking. And he says that faced with extremity, specialized thinking is not very useful. And in an interesting way, it reminded me of a statement by the Harvard economist Martin Weitzman, which I've used in some of my writing, where he recently said with respect to climate change, that the problem that economists have in converting climate into risk propositions about risk and therefore about policy, is that the policy sciences work better if the risks are on the lower side. But if the risks are catastrophic, then it's very hard to formulate policy. So in some ways, his argument was that specialized thinking is badly placed in dealing with problems of what he was looking at was a nuclear winter, problems of that scale. And the other argument that actually has been developing in conversation with friends is that one day it might be possible to look at the social science disciplines, politics, economics, history, and other disciplines, anthropology, to examine whether or not all these disciplines have actually assumed what we might one day call Holocene assumptions. But that's a topic for the future. So moving forward, he explained that this non-departmental, non-specialized thinking is best understood, he said, from the point of view of a general listener or reader who listens to experts and specialists explaining their view of a global problem, somewhat similar to our situation today. Physicists, biologists, military men, politicians, theologians, who all individually declare himself incompetent outside his special field, while the listener or reader is supposed to understand them all, to check their statements understandingly as best as he can, to gain an overall insight and to judge them in his turn on an overall basis. Now, but where is this complete man? Where is this general man who is listening to all the specialists and coming to their own conclusion? And it's clear, reading Jaspers, that this figure is not an empirical figure, because even in his own time he was quite aware that not everybody was interested in discussing the nuclear threat. So it's something that he's creating. So he's actually creating a position where both he himself as the reader and he himself as the writer, he sees these two figures as the figure of the general person who is actually contemplating a disaster and finding departmental thinking not useful, not helpful. So therefore he's actually hoping that, and Jaspers is struggling to produce a form of thought that issued from and addressed the position of an imagined general reader or listener, joining Jaspers in thinking at the limit of departmental thinking and on the existence of issues, I'm quoting, that concern the whole and are up to everyone. So the risk you take in, of course, turning to this German mode of thinking is that they're thinking the whole, all of humanity. And here, of course, Jaspers is again very interesting because he actually goes on to say, but the whole is always fragmented. It's very hard to actually get at the whole. But I'll come to that later, having set up the whole. But the other important characteristic in the meanwhile of epochal thought, as Jaspers conceived of it, was a negative one. And this I find very interesting and useful. It was negative in the sense that he said that epochal thought was granted to man without giving him the rest of a conclusion. Therefore, it takes stamina, I'm quoting, and calls for endurance in the tension of insolubility. For what it brings to bear on philosophy is not, I'm quoting, a matter of academic, that is departmental training, but a reality in man as a truly human, as a rational being. So again, this is something with which I will take issue, but somewhere he's saying that the reason why he thinks of epochal consciousness coming before politics is this idea that human beings have to confront, as it were, the danger they're faced with, and have the resource of rationality, according to him, as the means with which to deal with it and come to a sense of resolve within themselves for dealing with it, and then enter the political. So he's kind of creating this perspectival position, which in his own imagination gives the general reader and the listener or the hearer the resolve that is needed, because he goes on to say that a purely political thinking which is not informed by this resolve is not helpful, is at a loss in extremities. Because it's in extremity that political thinking, he says, needs the resolve of the human being in whom a change is wrought by extremity. So extremity has to work on the human being facing it. And that's the human being who is not thinking out of specialist thinking. And this rationality is something that Jaspers believed in, thought that if you didn't believe in the rational core of the human being, you lost your faith in man. Is something I'll come back to because I disagree with it. But that's the point he makes. And he was, as I said, very well aware that while we can, in the gesture of a deity, construct for ourselves an image of the whole, it's like this is what the gods see, an astronaut said once, looking at the Earth. The opinion that we can know what the whole is historically, or at this actual moment, really is fallacious. However one chooses to regard the epoch, it remains one of a number of obtainable perspectives of orientation. So in the end, then, epochal consciousness itself there's a methodological endeavor in it to get out of specialized thinking, to think about the whole, but while granting that you actually can't get a whole which is beyond your own perspective, so there's no objective whole. And therefore, for him, Jaspers acknowledges it, that actually to create an epochal consciousness as a perspectival point from where to look back on a crisis is itself there's a certain kind of precariousness in the experiment that it is in the danger of falling back into partisanship. So that is, it is in the danger of looking political, and therefore that's where the intellectual struggle is, to create that space. And therefore it remains a thought experiment in the face of an emergency that requires us to move towards composing the common. Some of the epochal themes that have marked the writings of many European theorists, going back to some of Jaspers' colleagues, from Cold War to the fall of the wall in 1989 may be listed as follows: the end of the Europeanization of the Earth, the question of constructing a multi-civilizational post-European world that otherwise ran the risk of technology promoting a culture of uniformity, the emergence of the planet or the globe as the whole Earth, or the whole Earth as a space for human dwelling as such. These themes that we encounter sometimes in globalization literature actually came up in Jaspers' generation and have carried over, as I said, into globalization discussion, but with a difference. We have to remember that much of the literature on globalization and post-colonial theory was directed against a particular fear that accompanied this world historical consciousness of European intellectuals, thinking in the German tradition. Thinkers such as Heidegger, Jaspers, Gadamer, Schmidt were all concerned about the possibility that once Europe lost control of the world it had brought together under its imperial aegis, only technology would hold the world together, producing a dull uniformity in world cultures that would leave humans feeling homeless. This was one reason why they were all interested actually in dating the period from which Europe declined. So in a way, all these European thinkers were interested in provincializing Europe in their own way. Gadamer, for instance, from whose prose I once borrowed the expression provincializing Europe, wrote in 1977 that Europe got provincialized, his word, as early as 1914. Nothing but the sciences, he said, evoked any resonance anywhere. Jaspers gives a date later. I mean, he also says, today the century of expansion is over and the European rule is over. In his Nomos of the Earth, Carl Schmitt dated the decline of geopolitical Eurocentrism from even earlier than 1914. For him, it began with the Monroe Doctrine, with the rise of American power, really. And the uniform figure, the second fear that these European thinkers had, and I'm just making these points to distance myself somewhat from this tradition from which I'm borrowing, the second fear, and post-colonial literature and globalization literature was a response to that, particularly cultural aspects of globalization literature, was the fear of the uniform figure of the mass man that haunted them. Again, Jaspers wrote about it, that films, I mean, they looked at films as producing this uniformity, technology was producing this uniformity, and we human beings meet each other less and less on the ground of our respective faiths. Heidegger made the same point very famously or infamously in an interview to Der Spiegel in 1966. Technology tears men loose from the earth and uproots them. And Gadamer, writing an essay in 1983, expressed the same fear. And it's the same fear that you can find in writings of all of these people, including Schmitt, that somehow this unity of the world that is made by technology, and that's why they saw the atom bomb as the culmination of that history of technology, will render man homeless. And out of that came certain questions of culture, like Gadamer was arguing that every culture must be authentic in itself in order for human beings to actually use the planet as their globe and meet together. And post-colonial literature and globalization literature, I think, was very much in a conversation with this tradition while opposing the fear that technology would necessarily produce this mass man, the uniform mass man. And this is what you find again in Schmidt's, the story that Schmitt tells in the Nomos of the Earth. So in kind of, so in a 2008 essay published in the American Historical Review, the historian Benjamin Lazier described this kind of historical thinking, which also has affected historiography, particularly in the second part of the 20th century, marked by a veritable lexical spill from world histories to global histories, and then from global to histories of planetary concerns. Now historians are writing books. Alison Bashford has written a book on the history of the population problem. When did people begin to get together to think about population as a planetary problem? Or Joyce Chaplin's book on Europeans going around the globe, creating a sense of the planet. And therefore, what Benjamin Lazier is talking about, this spill from world to global to planet. And of course, the words like world and globe and planet are not stable entities. World history once looked like the global history until in the 90s, when the very phenomenon of globalization prompted historians to ask if world history needed to attune itself to a distinctly global age, as Michael Geyer and Charles Bright put the question in 1995, or indeed, as Bruce Musley asked in 1991, if indeed the word global could ever be fully subsumed in the word world. A similar instability has, I could argue, has attended the fate of the word planetary, as it has traveled from the literature on globalization, where analysts use the word globe and planet as one and the same, to the literature on climate change. So if you look, I'm just read a couple of sentences from Smith's The Nomos. Here's one sentence which says, the compound term global linear thinking, he says, is better than planetary or a similar designation, which refer to the whole Earth but fail to capture its characteristic type of division. Or the first attempts in international law to divide the Earth as a whole, according to the new global concept of geography, began after 1492. These were also the first adaptation to the new planetary image of the world. So what I'm saying is that while we have had these words come up, for a long time in a lot of this literature, you'll find the word globe and the word planet being used as synonyms. It can be seen from these quotations above that for the theoretical approach Schmidt was attempting to develop, to understand the production of the global in human history, planetary was simply another word for global. It referred to the planet we live on, the Earth taken as a whole. This is exactly how many of the later scholars of globalization would use the word planetary to refer to the Earth as a whole. And this was, of course, a fulfillment of what many, from Heidegger to Sloterdijk, had seen as the age of the world picture, the global age. And from the point of view, from this point of view, the famous 1968 NASA picture of the Earth taken from the space, portraying the planet as a sphere that rises over the horizon of the moon, the one entitled Earthrise. In many places, actually, this is what the picture looked like. So it's not really Earthrise. It's kind of, it's not the moon is flat and you see Earth come up. But in many reproductions, they turn it by 90 degrees to make it look like Earthrise. And may be seen as the culmination of the use of the picture of the Earth as a globe, the planet on which we happen to live. It is humans looking in and picturing the whole Earth. This is, of course, from 1972. It's humans looking in and picturing the whole Earth as their home. The planet is what the globe is. Other planets are not in our field of view. So one of the themes I'll develop later on is that climate change comes from a science which actually, one part of it was actually engaged in what I call interplanetary studies. So those scientists were never simply thinking of this Earth as either our home or the only planet. So they had all other planets in view, but this is a picture in which only the Earth is in view. These pictures symbolized, for observers, the theme of human dwelling, its fulfillment as well as its breakdown. Heidegger expressed this crisis well in his 1966 interview, where he said, as he saw the first pictures, he said, I don't know if you were frightened, but I, at any rate, was frightened when I saw pictures coming from the moon to the Earth. We don't need any atom bomb. The uprooting of man has already taken place. The only thing we have left is purely technological relationships. This is no longer the Earth on which man lives. Hannah Arendt, in her Human Condition, of course, would somewhat change this to argue around the first Sputnik that man had been able to repudiate the Earth. Thus, the epochal consciousness, that is the history and narrative that the history and narrative of globalization produced, through the Cold War years and beyond, turned around the question of dwelling, human dwelling on Earth, in a process where the globe, the outcome of the history of European expansion, and the growth of capitalism as a world system that encountered the planet Earth, simply because the Earth was there to be so encountered. So it's like, so this becomes the culmination of Europe's expansion. Europe expands, the world gets connected, and finally we hit the limit of the world, which is the planet. So the world becomes the globe, and the globe is the planet. The globe and the planet in the end merge into one another insofar as the globalization theorists are concerned. This was the lexical spill, as Lagier puts it, from the word Earth to the word Earth, planet, and globe. The parallel turn in the environmental movement from environment to globe, as in global environment, he points out, goes in tandem with this globalization of the world picture. There are three things to be noted about this consciousness of globalization. It turns, as I said, on the question of humans dwelling together in a global world, when technology weaves the planet into a huge network of connections. The history it recalls is the history of the last 500 years or so, the history of European expansion, of globalizing capital with all its inequities, and of modern technology. And C, while the environmental concerns of the last 4 decades did call attention to man's relationship to his environment, including other species, this epochal consciousness remained profoundly homocentric. European humans were at the center of this narrative, however it was told. So in a way, I'm really trying to, in what I'm trying to do so far, is to open up the history of the expression differentiated responsibilities. The story of planetary climate change carries with it the narrative of globalization, but also departs from it in a radical manner. The science of climate change has its roots going back to 19th and 20th century investigations by European and American scientists, both amateur and professional. But more immediately, it is the product of the Cold War, the detonation of the nuclear bomb that made for new oceanographic and atmospheric studies by the United States. Spencer Weird and Joshua Howe have recently told this story in fascinating detail, and one of the interesting parts, the prehistory of climate science, modern climate science, post-war, is very much American interest in actually using weather as a military weapon, whether you could cause floods in the enemy's territory or cause weather disruption in the enemy's territory. And a lot of people were paid money to study the atmosphere, to see if the atmosphere could be could be militarized. The science, one could say, as I said, was mainly American. Its immediate context lay in the competition between the US and the Soviet Union for the mastery of space. It is not even a culminating point in the history of the ecological crisis that for humans that Gadamer, Schmidt, and others have acknowledged and discussed as a coming danger. And the climate crisis, interestingly, was not even part of environmentalism, because the climate problem could not have been actually deciphered from within the available narratives of environmental pollution, or with the methodological tools that allow us to reconstruct something like the history of capital. Diagnosing global warming entailed the involvement of other kinds of sciences. Understanding the phenomenon of climate change required the development of a form of planetary thinking, which was, as I said, both interdisciplinary as well as interplanetary. It involved a knowledge of how Earth systems functioned, and that itself is a development of a subdiscipline of science, which basically developed in the 1980s, but its beginnings go back to space research of the 1960s, of geology and of the history of life on this planet, in addition to what globalization theorists take an interest in, which is the history of the world market for production and consumption. By introducing new questions of scale, environmental scale, astronomical scales for space, geological scales for time, and scales of evolutionary time for the history of life, all in search of understanding the relationship between the history of the planet's atmosphere, its life and its life-carrying capacity, and thus promoting what may be called a life or zoe-centric view of the history of the planet. The literature on global warming works at a tangent to the completely homocentric narrative of globalization. This tension is best seen in the work of someone we will consider in the next lecture, James Lovelock of the Gaia fame. So in a way, again, I'm going back to that expression, common but differentiated responsibility, and I'm saying differentiated responsibility brings the history of globalization to the table. But common, to think common, one opens up this other history. So both globalization narratives and scientists' concern over dangerous climate change share an interest in human well-being. But while globalization theorists argue about the capacity of the existing economic and political institutions to deliver well-being for all humans, the science of planetary climate change ends up making the conditions for the flourishing of life in general on the planet into a condition for ordinary human flourishing. The two sets of literature that also develop a tension between their two master categories, humanity for globalization and the human species for climate change. Elaborating on this tension and its implications is the task I'll set myself in the next lecture. The beginning of the divergence between homocentric perceptions of the planet and what I've called the zoe-centric view of it may be seen in some of the key responses to the 1968 Christmas Eve American astronauts' view of Earthrise over the moon, a topic on which Robert Poole has written a very engrossing book. Immediate responses to the sight of Earth, both of these pictures, seen from space, evoked thoughts, two kinds of thoughts, that you can see the beginning of the two approaches I'm talking about, the homocentric and the zoe-centric. The immediate responses included thoughts about human dwelling, with astronauts spontaneously expressing the hope that Fred Hoyle, the astronomer, and Arthur Clarke, the science fiction writer, who in turn had been influenced by Arnold Toynbee's ideas about the unification of the world, and others had articulated in the 1950s, that humanity might now see the whole Earth as their home, bringing an end to all nationalist and other ideological strife. Alongside these reactions that focused on man, there were others that focused on life as such. The microbiologist René Dubos remarked how drab and gray, unappealing and insignificant this planet would be without the radiance of life. And the ecologist David Worcester spoke of the thin film of life that covered this planet, because this was the only colorful object in space when you look at space. The difference between homocentric and zoe-centric views of the world is perhaps best illustrated through some remarks that James Lovelock made in passing in his book, The Many Ages of Gaia, while recalling the time when he teamed up with his friend Michael Allaby to write a fictional book called The Greening of Mars, trying to imagine how humans might begin to inhabit the red planet. Apparently, Allaby wanted a world, and I'm quoting, on which to act out a new colonial expansion, a place with new environmental challenges and free of the tribal problems of the earth, a vision of terraforming, a word often used when considering this act of making a place habitable. Making a planet habitable. Actually, if you go back and look at some of the pictures in National Geographic of imagination of Mars as inhabited, Mars looked like Manhattan. You kind of wondered what made Mars look like Manhattan, the new settlements. Terraforming, to Lovelock's ears, had the homocentric flavor of a planetary scale technological fix, redolent of bulldozers and agribusiness. He preferred the eco-poetic expression, the making of a home, the process whose imagination does not begin with humans, but with life. To make Mars a fit home for life, writes Lovelock, even as he believed that Mars was too arid to host life, we shall first have to make the planet comfortable for bacterial life. So you kind of come back to this question of life in general being the condition of human life. It is this latter view that places humans firmly within a larger view of life and planetary dynamics that I'm calling zoe-centric for my purposes here. Both these views were co-present, for instance, what the American modernist poet and the librarian of the Congress, Archibald MacLeish, wrote on December 25, 1968, in an immediate response to the picture of Earthrise. His poem, prose poem, called Riders of Earth Together, Brothers in Eternal Cold, had these two themes running through it. And I'll give you just two examples, one of what I call homocentric thinking, the other one I call zoe-centric thinking. So the homocentric, just to give you a few lines from the poem, and this is homocentric: to see the earth as it truly is, small and blue and beautiful in that eternal silence where it floats, is to see ourselves as riders on the earth together. Brothers on that bright loveliness in the eternal cold, brothers who now know that they're truly brothers. And here's the zoe-centric view in the same poem. For the first time in all of time, men have seen whole and sound and beautiful as even Dante had never dreamed of seeing it. As the 20th century philosophers of absurdity and despair were incapable of guessing that it might be seen. And seeing it so, one questions come to the minds of those who looked at it. Is it inhabited? They said to each other and laughed. And they did not laugh. What came to their minds 100,000 miles and more into space, halfway to the moon they put it, what came to their minds was life on that little lonely floating planet. The tiny raft in the enormous empty night, is it inhabited? In fact, one of the interesting problems that comes out of what I'm calling zoe-centric view that geologists acknowledge is called the habitability problem of a planet. What makes a planet habitable? Again, something to be taken up. So the last part of the lecture tonight, and I want to then introduce this introduce a particular distinction in order to think the homocentric and the zoe-centric opposition. It must be of interest to scholars in the humanities that the word human has turned out to be one of the most contested and disputed categories of in the social and political literature on climate change. The use of the word anthropos, for instance, in the expression anthropogenic climate change, or the Anthropocene, or for that matter, the use of the word human in calling something human-induced climate change, has invited the not unreasonable retort, why blame all humans or humans in general when it is the addiction to fossil fuel, when the addiction is shared only by a minority of humans, the global rich, the consuming classes of the world, and of course, interested groups such as the producers and marketeers of fossil fuels or their advocates. Scholars from China, India, and other countries have often complained that the word anthropos, when used thus, ends up falsely and unfairly implicating the poor and their survival emissions of greenhouse gases in the crime of those whose luxury emissions are actually responsible for the current crisis. The word anthropos in the expression anthropogenic climate change has a very particular orientation. This planet, Earth, has seen dramatic and planetary climate changes before. When we call this particular episode of climate change anthropogenic, we do so in order to distinguish this present episode of climate change from previous instances of climate change that were caused by non-anthropogenic geophysical, geological factors such as shift in tectonic plates, volcanic eruptions, impact of asteroids, and other things. Thus, we put the current episode of the warming of the planet in a series of similar episodes, and the name anthropogenic has the same function as have the different sound values of different alphabet in a Sassurian chain of signs, that is to differentiate itself from what precedes and what follows it. The word does not designate or connote an inward-oriented sense of uniqueness or humanness. Anthropos here has no moral value, and therefore it does not signify culpability. It is there simply to suggest that the kind of geophysical force usually needed to change the climate of the planet as a whole was supplied this time, unlike at any other time in the history of the planet, mainly by actions of humans. It's a causal term that does not signify any moral responsibility, but it does signify causal responsibility. A similar point may be made about the use of the anthropos in attempts by geologists to define a new epoch called the Anthropocene. Some scholars, mainly from the left, have expressed deep discomfiture and asked, why don't you call it Capitalocene? Because it's capitalism that's caused it. Yet it's arguable that the names of geological periods are not normally meant to say anything about the causes that brought the particular period about. The name Holocene, meaning recent times, suggests nothing about why an interglacial warm period set in the geological time it designates. Similarly, the name Anthropocene is more about whether or not geologists could now scientifically argue that future geologists, millions of years from today, will detect consistent, planet-wise and synchronous signals in strata of the Earth, suggesting that the planet was significantly modified by the work of a species called Homo sapiens. The name does not assign responsibility or even name a cause. But the moment we define climate change not just as a physical phenomenon, but as dangerous, the moment we say it's dangerous climate change, we are in the realm of values, and hence of disagreement and politics. You know, I have two colleagues in my geophysics department, Raymond Pierre Humbert and David Archer. Both have written books on climate change. Raymond's book, which is a textbook, is called Planetary Science. And the chapter on warming is called Planetary Warming, because global warming is only a part of the general category, planetary warming. And he has a section on global warming on this planet. And it's a completely dispassionate analysis of what goes on. He says one day it might be known as this particular event that took away the dinosaurs, or some other event. David Archer writes a book which is like an activist book, and he begins by asking people to appreciate the implications of saying that human beings have already changed the climate for 100,000 years. And even though he's a scientist, he begins the book by saying, imagine this. What if the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, had discovered fossil fuel and lived it up 3,000 years ago? Would you still consider them to be the height of Western civilization? But you can see what happens the moment you raise questions of dangerous climate change, and dangerous can only be judged by the use of our values. We are actually in the realm of not causal but moral responsibility. The moment you ask questions of moral responsibility, humanity immediately fragments. So when Archer is trying to persuade a group, he assumes that his readers are people who are very invested in what you think of the classical Greeks. So actually, in effect, he's actually appealing to what he presumes to be Westerners, putative or real. And the human problem of climate change, therefore, cannot be defined without some discussion of human values, ethics, suffering, and attachments, topic on which physical sciences have a very limited purchase. The idea of a dangerous climate change is not itself a scientific idea. Understanding and defining what planetary climate change is indeed something for which we depend on scientific knowledge, but dangerous is not a scientific word. As my friend and colleague Julia Thomas has recently said, historians coming to grips with the Anthropocene cannot rely on our scientific colleagues to define the endangered human for us. Endangerment, she points out, is never a simple scientific fact. It's a question of both scale and value. It is thus when we think of the climate crisis through the idea of moral and not causal responsibility, that climate change becomes a question of justice, and hence a political question as well. Who should own the moral responsibility for the emission of gases? Who should pay for it? Global warming then poses a problem of intrahuman justice. The figure of humanity differentiates itself from the anthropos of the Anthropocene, say. At this point, we think of the political figure of humanity as having two somewhat contradictory characteristics. Firstly, it's an entity that is capable of projecting itself into the future as a purposeful entity, even though the purpose may not always be or win universal approval. And a friend of mine has written an interesting book about Islamic terrorists, saying that even if the Islamic terrorists actually are looking for a humanity, if they have a program for converting everybody to Islam, I mean, this is it's a wonderful book called Terrorists in Search of a Humanity, Faisal Devji. So we think of humanity as this capacity to project ourselves, but we also know that this humanity is always already divided by issues that give rise precisely to questions of justice. One could argue then, and this is my last paragraph, one could argue then that this category humanity is a product of the very process of the general mondialization of the world, the superimposition of the world with the globe of the planet. It reflects a modern formation, something brought about into being by the techno-economic framework networks that made this planet the home that we saw from space. Let us call this figure of one but divided humanity by the Latin word homo, simply to distinguish it from the Greek anthropos that has already been claimed by scientists, even though the words mean the same thing. So when we read the word homo used in this sense into the word anthropos as discussed above in the context of anthropogenic climate change, we see climate change as a continuation of the story of capitalist globalization, accentuating all the human iniquities that are central to that story, however told. But planetary climate change and the Anthropocene are also events driven by non-human, non-living vectors that work on multiple scales, some of which work on geological scales, while some have implications within the time horizon of 1 or 2 human generations. That which works over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, cannot be brought within the realm of policy and politics. But the moment we say we should do something to prevent dangerous climate change, we raise questions about damages, costs, and responsibility, and we read what I've called homo back into the word anthropos as used in the expression anthropogenic climate change or the Anthropocene. In the politics of climate justice, then, one may therefore say that homo comes to be where anthropos was. So I finished there for this evening, and the next lecture I'll explore further the implications of this distinction between homo and anthropos that I've set up, and come back to the question of epochal consciousness and what it means. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.